Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special episode tonight. We have two stars in the research community. We have Nate Joseph, uh, Nathaniel Hansford, and we have Kathryn Garforth, and they both worked on a meta-analysis together, and it's called an exploratory quantitative analysis of research on balanced literacy and structured literacy. Let me give you a little bit of background about our two guests. Kathryn is the founder of Garforth Education and the Right to Read Initiative. Garforth Education provides online courses and professional development for educators. And Nate Joseph has taught every grade in pre-K to 12 in places like South Korea, the United Kingdom, Ontario, and the subarctic of Quebec. In 2022, he won the Literacy Leader of the Year award from the Ontario International Dyslexia Association. And he is coming out with his second edition of his book in March, and that is The Scientific Principles of Reading and Writing Instruction, Bridging the Divide Between Educational Practice and Research. And Nate, we hope you are going to raffle off one of your books for us in the spring for our audience. I'm putting you on the spot.
Absolutely, no problem whatsoever.
I love that, Faith. I love when Faith puts people on the spot. That's how we start a show. So, Faith, can you tell
That's your
our audience
specialty.
Yes,
before
all
we,
right.
Faith, before we begin, can you tell our audience what they will get out of this? What's the value and what's our promise in this amazing episode?
Okay, so this episode, clearly the research is on structured literacy and how it compares to balanced literacy. And this is a meta-analysis, which means that it's not just one study. They've looked at multiple studies. And this is so important in this space because when people want to debate, it's very hard to debate against research over many years with multiple studies, and we're going to hear it from the people who actually conducted the study. So, what is our audience going to get out of this? One, the truth. All right. No BS type of answers here. It's going to come, right from the researchers. And two, we hope to put some of the controversy to rest on this episode so that
Faith, I
this
got
way,
one more
yep,
question.
sure.
What is it going to do for people like me that's a practitioner in the field? How can this help me?
Okay, that is a great question because we have mostly teachers listening and watching. So I'm actually going to pass that over to our guests. All right. What is it that teachers will get out of this discussion in a practical sense? So I don't care who starts, it doesn't matter to us. Who wants to kick that off?
I think Garforth wants to. I can see it in your face. Go for it, Garforth.
Well, I remember when I was in my teacher education program, and they said it takes 20 years to go from research to practice. And I know in today's world, time is something that unfortunately most of us are poor in, very time poor, especially when you're working, in the schools, in the classroom. There's always stuff to do. And reading through a bunch of scholarly journal articles is not always high on the priority. I know I'm a little different than most, but I often have multiple tabs of articles that I want to read open on my computer, because I'm more of a nonfiction reader than a fiction reader. But recognizing that it takes a long time to go all through all these articles, it takes a lot of knowledge about statistics, which, takes a little bit of time to get, and it's more than a person wants to do in the hour or two they have in an evening after their job for the day is done. So the beauty of a meta-analysis is you have people that know what they are doing, um, go through the articles, pull out the important pieces of information, and then collate them properly. And, Nate has a gorgeous system for this. And he has huge databases of lots of various research papers, and he understands the statistics that needs to be done, and does it. And then we're able to take the information that has been gathered from hundreds of thousands of students when you consider the number of studies that were included in this paper and the sample size is of those groups. Understanding that we're not just looking at one particular instant, we're looking at general trends across various populations in teaching reading. And literacy is such an important aspect of life. We need to take full advantage of the time that we have with our students to teach them in the most effective way possible for the most amount of students.
But let me stop you. So, Kathryn,
Mhm.
so clearly you guys did the work, and this is important work. And Nate has this beautiful system that really helps to collate the information.
Mhm.
Nate, what does that mean for teachers in a practical sense? So, yes, they can appreciate the work that goes
Yeah.
into this, but so what do they do with it? They're not the ones making the
Yeah.
decisions, right? The
Yeah.
teachers are not the decision makers. So, what do they do with this?
Well, I'm going to give three simple takeaways, I think, for teachers, but I want to make a couple caveats. And I'll just say, to kind of summarize what I think Kathryn's trying to say is we read 68 studies, so you don't have to. Um, but I actually
Nate,
want to like,
Nate, sorry, I have to interrupt. Faith, where's the
yeah,
cheers button? Get it out. Oh, she's muted, but there she is cheering away.
okay. Well,
Right here.
there we go. I love it. So, but I actually want to back up for a little bit of a second. And one of our core findings wasn't even efficacy related, it was marketing related. In fact, I think the most important finding we have was marketing related. Because we've been in this sort of for the last, I think, 4 to 5 years debate between structured literacy to balanced literacy. But we have already had this debate. And I didn't realize this when I started the research. In fact, I didn't even realize it, so I started the peer review part. Because when I started to go through the peer review, my peer reviewers were like, well, what is structured literacy? What is balanced literacy? And how is that different from whole language and systematic phonics? And then when I tried to answer that question, I dove deeper and I'm like, oh my God, there is no difference. Structured literacy and systematic phonics are basically the same thing. Now, I want to make a caveat there. They're definitionally different. The definition you will see for systematic phonics is different than the definition from structured literacy. However, if you look at the studies that have been labeled as systematic phonics studies and structured literacy studies, they're the same damn studies. If you look at a lot of the programs that people called structured or systematic phonics in the year 2000, they're the same programs we're calling structured literacy today. Um, whereas whole language, I actually think it's a little closer because for balance, if you look at the definitions that exist in the peer-reviewed literature for balanced literacy, they are almost word for word identical for the definitions that were in the peer-reviewed literature for whole language. And I think what really happened is in like the early 2000s, there was research that came out and showed systematic phonics was better than whole language, and there were a whole bunch of papers that came out showing that. And the people who were selling whole language programs, they rebranded as balanced literacy, and they said we're not against phonics, we just want balance. And that just tiny marketing trick was so effective that I think balanced literacy took over and became way more popular than systematic phonics. But then, I think in 2018, systematic phonics people kind of wised up and they're like, we are losing a marketing battle. And then they're like, well, we're going to teach structured literacy. And I think the genius of it is when you say balanced literacy, you automatically imply that other programs are not balanced. And when you say structured literacy, you automatically imply that other programs are not structured. And I think this was all really a marketing thing. But I actually think for teachers and researchers, there's really good news in knowing that this is all just marketing, in the sense that we already have 20 years of research, actually 25 years of research, if we include this paper, showing that systematic phonics outperforms whole language. Once you realize that, actually, it kind of invalidated the need for our whole paper, because really it just became a replication paper once we realized that. Because again, it's like half the studies that are in the National Reading Panel meta were in our structured literacy meta. It's the same pool of studies. We just increased the pool by taking some more modern studies and putting them in there, really. So I think it's really helpful to know that it's not just our meta. And it's ironic. I'm on a podcast after this with Dr. Corey Peltier, and he told me something like a couple of years ago. It's really stuck with me. And it's that one meta-analysis is not enough to prove anything. And it's such a funny thing, because meta-analysis, actually, it's really hard. And I don't want to be the one guy, or people are like, Nate's paper prove this, or Nate and Kathryn's paper prove this. I'd feel way more comfortable saying, hey, our paper and like 15 other metas on the topic showed the same thing. And then every meta on the topic for 25 years has shown the same thing. Systematic phonics works better than whole language. And actually, I think one of the things that people on that whole language balance literacy side get caught up on is they're saying, hey, you're saying our approach doesn't work. I can tell you, as a teacher, I've had examples where it worked. I've seen it work in my classroom. I've seen kids learn to read. I learned in a whole language classroom. How can this not work? And it's not to say that their approach doesn't work. In fact, I can point to peer-reviewed studies where kids improved at reading after receiving whole language instruction. It's to say that there are other approaches out there that work better, and that they might also work better for specific populations, like dyslexic students, for example. So I think it makes sense to say, hey, we're going to take the approach that has been proven for 25 years to work better, rather than the approach that's been proven for 25 years to not work better. And in terms of just practical takeaways, I would say three main takeaways from the paper for teachers. One, you need to be using, if you're teaching grades 1 to 3, you need to be using, or kindergarten to 3, actually, kindergarten to 2. I keep changing my mind here a little bit. When you're an early reading teacher, you need to be including a systematic phonics program. And what that really means is that it's explicit, and that it has a scope and sequence for what graphemes it's going to teach. That's the number one thing. You have to be explicitly teaching graphemes to early readers. And that's not really exciting news at this point. It's kind of old news. I think there's some research in there to suggest that it's the phonics, though, that matters the most. We have some suggestion that decodables might be helpful, but it's not the decodables that are the most important part. It's the phonics. And I think we get caught up on the decodables versus level text sometimes too, because that's where the money is, honestly. And that's not to say people shouldn't be using decodables. I sell decodables. So like I have a financial incentive to tell you only use decodables right now. Another thing that I think really came up as a finding was the scope and sequences. So when we did the preprint, I think a year and a half ago or a year ago, I forget, we found that the faster scope and sequence was, the better it was as a program. Now, when we went through the peer review, they made us test the statistical significance of that claim, and I found out the significance was bunk. Like, there was no real significant correlation. But if you look at all of these studies where we saw positive improvements, they were all in a range of 2 to 5 letters per week. So I think we can really safely say that phonics programs should be teaching 2 to 5 letters per week. And I still hear teachers telling me I'm teaching 1 letter per week. In fact, I was talking to a principal recently where they said they had a teacher who was teaching at 1 letter sound per week, and that their standard test scores were really low. And that doesn't surprise me. I didn't find a single research study where they're only teaching 1 a week. And then the other big finding, I think, from the paper is that we found that there's no research really showing phonics is effective after grade 2 in core instruction. So sometimes online and social media, I see people saying we should teach phonics K to 8. I've even seen some people say K to 12. There's no research to support that. But where we did find support was that for older struggling readers who didn't yet have that decoding knowledge, they benefited just as much as like a grade 1 student, sometimes if not more. And that was a finding, I think, in some of the earlier phonetics and phonics meta-analyses that wasn't there. So I think that was our most important finding, is that we helped to just confirm what I think everyone who's in this industry who really knows what they're talking about already knew. Like Judy and Faith are not questioning, do older struggling readers need phonics if they can't decode it? Of course they do. But now we have a peer-reviewed citation to suggest that yes, that's true. So
So
sorry, I feel like I talked forever there.
no, it was good because you did give us important takeaways. And as a matter of fact, the one that you just said on older students, I pulled out as something I wanted to address. So I'm glad you said it. I didn't even have to ask. Judy, tell us what you got out of what Kathryn and Nate just told us. So now you ask the question about, well, what about someone like me or my, teachers in my school? What does this do for us? Was your question answered? And do you have any feedback for them based on what they told you?
So I think the one thing that it definitely does, it reaffirms what I know has been working even at my own sites, right? Everybody knows I was in a balanced literacy environment for 15 years and I had no scope and sequence. It was just a kibosh of different things. And yes, there were positive things happening, but there really wasn't the shifts and outcomes that we're having with the structured literacy approach, which I've been working with in many of my sites for years. Things are moving so much more effectively. We're monitoring goals, we're progress monitoring. We have a scope and sequence to follow. So it's very reaffirming. The other thing that I find helpful is the reminder that there are kids in older grades that will still benefit from systematic and structured literacy. And I think what was said by you guys just reminds us, yes, not everybody is going to need that. The kids that crack the code may very well might not need that. And we can't waste those kids' time because they have other things, bigger fish to fry, right? Which is
100%.
comprehending and the deeper knowledge and all of those pieces and state tests and text analysis and so forth. But there
Can I
are
get
many kids in the older grades that are still struggling to crack the code. So, like for instance, in one of the sites where I'm working, we do have a phonics program in grade 3, which is very helpful to a lot of our learners. But I think we have to also start thinking, who are we helping? Does the whole class need it? Do some kids need it? Because I think it also ties into what Kathryn said. Teachers don't have that much time. And a lot of schools right now, in the sites where, I'm working and coaching and so forth, teachers are struggling with time. And they're getting many mandates from districts. You need to do this. You need to do this. You need to make sure you do science. You need to make sure you do social studies. You need to also make sure you do phonics. You need to make sure you do shared reading. You need to make sure that you do phonemic awareness instruction. And guess what? Teachers are completely overwhelmed and they understand, yes, this is important. And they understand, yes, this is important. But you know what? It's also very important that we get our kids to learn how to read. And if we don't get our kids to learn how to read and read on their own, things aren't going to look very good in the upper grades. And it's going to be a very, very big problem. And it's wonderful if kids could understand, and it's wonderful if kids, can have auditory processing and understand passages and understand those read alouds. But the main goal that we want to also accomplish is that kids can lift those words off the page and make those deeper text analysis and comprehend on their own. So, how are we going to get them there? And are we giving kids that time to apply those skills? And I'm very fearful, though, and I hope that Kathryn and Nate will tie this in somehow, is how do we make sure that application is prioritized? It was, I just want to say off the record, hard to hear Nate mention that there's, and we've heard this before on the Literacy View, that there's not a lot of studies that show definitively that decodables shift the needle. I know in my experience, they're shifting the needle for a lot of our kiddos in many of my sites because it's a key piece of the application where kids are getting to take what they're learning in isolation and transfer it. So that was a little hard to hear, and I've heard it before on the Literacy View. But, so many great takeaways, so much reassurance that, systematically the whole system, I feel like it's in the United States, definitely you're in Canada, guys, right? That people are moving in a positive direction, but still a lot of thoughts. Faith,
So,
what's on your mind?
yeah, so I want to piggyback on what Judy just said. So, she said something very important. It was about how teachers feel overwhelmed because there are all these mandates. So, based on your meta analysis, can you tell us what really should be prioritized? Because, as you said, Nate, you mentioned marketing and how a lot of things happen in this space because there's good marketing of some buzzwords and how you manipulate the conversation is all about sales, ultimately. And
100%.
we've spoken about this and it's still happening, right? Maybe it's a different buzzword, but it's still happening now. So I'd like to throw that out to both of you based on what Judy just said. What needs to be prioritized so it doesn't just become a marketing game for publishers? Could you both talk a little bit about that?
Kathryn, why don't you go first? I think I talked a lot already.
I think like the key thing is that educators, whatever their role, really understand the students that they are teaching because you need to focus your instruction to the needs of the kids that you are working with. And if you don't do that, then the needle's not going to move. In reality, the classrooms that we see today are not like the ones that we were seeing in the 80s and 90s. The diverse population within the classrooms, the diverse language backgrounds are things that, last century, we didn't have the same occurrence happening. So we need to not just say, oh, well, it used to work. Why isn't it working now? Well, no, it didn't really actually used to work. We figured out the best way to cast the broadest net to reach the most amount of students the first time that they learn. And based on the information we collect, we can inform the instructional choices. So, looking at screening measures to inform your practice. And as Judy mentioned, she has, a grade 3 classroom that's still having, a phonics instruction. Well, based on the needs of the students in that classroom, it's what's needed, right? But then in classrooms where the kids are reading, decodable text with 2 and 3 syllable words in grade 1, it's recognizing the needs of the students that are in front of you and going with their needs to dictate your instruction, not some commercially purchased product that says on day 5 you're doing this lesson.
All right. So, Nate, do you have anything to add to that? I want to just stop for a second because Kathryn mentioned we have to look at the needs of the students in front of us. Yet, often teachers are being told, that whole class, whole group is the way to go. And I certainly agree that whole class is the way to go to reach the most kids. But then teachers must be getting a mixed message now. I'm only trying to put myself in their shoes, hearing, well, we have to go by the needs of the students, yet I'm being told whole class lessons are the way to go. So how do I meet the needs of all these students? So Nate, when you jump in, if you could just dive into that a bit too.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think that's actually a really great question. Um, I do want to say to start, I don't think this paper can answer the original question that you asked us, because our scope was just too narrow. I do feel like I can answer the question based on previous like research I've read and looked at. And I like to go back to the five pillars of literacy to start, which is a term that's contentious actually, but came from the National Reading Panel. And it was the five things that the National Reading Panel seemed to show the most evidence for. And, I've spent a lot of time, people sometimes think of me as this guy who does a lot of meta-analysis. I spend way more time reading other people's metas than I do writing my own. And when I think of like the collective bodies of meta-analysis, research, and education, those five pillars, they make a lot of sense to me in the sense that we have tons and tons of metas behind all of them showing them are effective. So I think, and I'm going to add a sixth pillar if that's okay. But I think, phonics is the most important pillar at that early start. And I think phonemic awareness, depending on how you look at the definition used, it kind of fits as an umbrella inside of phonics. But I think it's reasonable to include some phonemic awareness. Now, that depends on what we mean by phonemic awareness, because my definition of it is different than other people's. When I say phonemic awareness, I mean segmenting and blending instruction, because that's the type of phonemic awareness we have evidence that suggests it works. We don't have evidence that suggests deletion and manipulation are effective forms of instruction, which always gets somebody mad at me for saying, but it's true. Like there's just everybody who's really an expert in this field is saying the same thing. Every paper on it has shown the same thing. There's no evidence behind those things. I would say that we also need fluency instruction. I think fluency is sometimes, I think Tim Brzezinski or Dr. Tim Brzezinski, shout out to him, is right, is sort of unnecessarily forgotten. I think it's incredibly important. Every day, kids need opportunities to read. No matter what grade level they are, we need to provide opportunities for some authentic reading experience. And I sound like a balanced literacy person there after coming on here to discuss the paper, criticize Malcolm, but they were right about that. Fluency is incredibly important. And I've heard Judy talk about the fact that she feels like sometimes in the structured literacy era, she doesn't see enough kids reading in classrooms, and I agree with her. I think, the most contentious one on there is comprehension. And sometimes people separate out comprehension and vocabulary as separate pillars. I would say, based on a paper that Kathryn and I also have behind peer review right now, that vocabulary is really just sort of part of comprehension. Like vocabulary is a form of comprehension instruction. So I would kind of combine those, but there's more to comprehension. That's like the in giant can of worms if we tried to dive into that one. But comprehension instruction includes trying to teach students how to find the main idea, how to summarize. I know it's contentious to say nowadays, but it also includes teaching background knowledge, and it includes teaching vocabulary and meaning. And one I'm slightly more skeptical on, but lots of people are in favor of, is text structure. That all sort of, to me, fits under that one umbrella of comprehension instruction. Although you can't explicitly teach a skill of comprehension, that's not a thing. And I would say the last pillar I would personally add is morphology. I think, especially after grade 3, having a little bit of morphology instruction every day is important. These are things that I include in all my class instruction on a regular basis. Like I'm a teacher too. I'm not a researcher. I do research as a hobby because I'm a weirdo. No, like these are the things I include in my instruction every day and that I think are important because we just have a huge body of research showing they're important. Now, I feel like a lot of researchers are kind of sitting, I hate to say it, but a little bit of an ivory tower. And they have their list of 75 things that they think are important that should be covered on a daily basis and the very specific ways they should be covered. And even as a person who reads and writes about education research constantly, I cannot keep up with the list that the professors will hand out to you of things that should be included in your instruction on a daily basis. So I think focusing on those big things is what really matters. It's where you're going to get the bang for your buck. I don't think it means we only teach those things. I just think it means that those are the focuses of our day, whether we're a grade 1 teacher or a grade 12 teacher, and how that shifts. How as the grades change, it shifts. Like you're not going to be teaching phonics in a grade 12 classroom. You're still going to be teaching fluency. You're still going to be teaching comprehension, and you might throw in a little bit of morphology into that. I would even go so far that say that spelling might be its own pillar, although I think spelling kind of touches on morphology and phonics. I feel like if you're teaching spelling right, you're teaching it through morphology and phonics. But I think sometimes in literacy programs, not all, but they really focus on like spelling and reading as oral reading activities. Like put the word up on the board, have the kids read out the word, um, blend the word for the kid, have them segment it, that type of thing. And there's not any like writing. I think every single literacy class should include writing.
Yay, Nate, I
And
was waiting for that. I wanted to hear writing and oral language. Thank you.
yeah, well, and I think oral language honestly fits under that umbrella of comprehension too, if I'm honest. Although you could definitely put it into its own um, pillar. In terms of your question, Faith, I do think for most students, you're getting your biggest bang for your buck from direct and explicit instruction of whole language. But I recently wrote this article on how do we support students who are older, struggling readers. Thinking that from like as a teacher who's taught grade 8 for a long time, you're always every single year, no matter what class, what school you're working at, you're going to have a couple kids who come in lower, and I think identifying those students using screening methods is really important. And I think then diving in with assessments to say, what are these students' specific needs is also really important, and teaching to those specific needs. I mean, Matt Burns did a really good paper, I think about 5 years ago, maybe 7 actually, where they looked at comparing just a general reading intervention where the teacher took like a one size fits all approach and tried to teach a holistic way to students, and compared it to where the teacher did like a targeted intervention where they diagnosed the students' needs and taught specifically to those needs. And it showed double the results for the teacher who taught to the needs of the student in the reading intervention. So when we talk about the importance of teaching to the student in front of you, I think that's crucial for intervention. But I still think a lot of the heavy lifting in your classroom is still going to happen through or sorry, not whole language, through whole class instruction.
All right, so Judy, in listening to that response, we've talked about this. You're in a situation where you're K to 2, you're in a K to 2 world, and then you have people who are outside of that K to 2 world telling people in the K to 2 world what they should be teaching. And they really kind of look at it from their own point of view of what's important, because they're going backwards by design, right? So they see where kids need to be at a certain point, and they keep dropping these things down into the lower grades, saying, well, you should be doing this and this and this. And I've seen this conversation on spell links about multi-component instruction and how important it is to integrate. But clearly, we have to integrate, but we also have to prioritize. So, what are your thoughts about that? Because we've had this discussion about early childhood, and yet people who kind of look in the upper grades thinking that what goes on there should happen equally down in the lower grades. What are your thoughts about that?
So I would have given you cheers, but right now I have the BS button, so I'm not going to press anything right now. You know I'm a hot mess after work, Faith. You know how it goes over here. But I think you make a very important point, Faith. I think that as we develop professional development in our schools, we have to not forget that K to 2's needs might look very different than 3 to 5's needs. And it's okay to have some professional development together, right? Maybe your school's doing explicit instruction. And what do your lessons look like? I do, we do, you do. That's all great. But I really think it's important for our field to realize that the needs in early childhood, K to 2, may look very different, especially at certain points in the year. Like right now, I'm sweating bricks. I'm sweating bricks. It's almost MOY time, which means middle of the year screener time. That's coming right after the new year, right after I come back from China, from visiting my son who's studying abroad. That's it. We have to get those screeners going. And guess what? If you didn't focus enough attention on what the kids in K to 2 need, which is learning how to read and showing that they can apply those skills with the foundational skills, you're going to have a scary surprise coming your way, where you're going to give kids an oral reading fluency passage, which is what is required in the middle of the year, for first grade, and that doesn't mean they have to read 100 words a minute, but they're supposed to be able to read a good amount of words and understand what they read. You're going to get an ugly surprise if your core instruction didn't address the needs of those learners. And that doesn't mean it's only small group. What did we do in whole group? Did we listen to kids read? Yes, we all know that knowledge is important too. And it's not something we should skip. And I'm not saying that. And I don't think that we should wait to focus on learning about spiders and sharks and civilization and log cabins like we do in some of the nonfiction texts that we're reading in many of my sites. But we also need to prioritize and think about what's important, and the same goes for grades 3 to 5. We have to understand what's important and a priority for those kids in a certain period of time, and also make sure that we're budgeting our time appropriately.
So I
And I
want
think,
to piggyback on what Judy just
wait,
said.
let me finish one thing, Faith.
Yeah.
And I think that, districts can say you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. But I think districts also need to think about, what is my data, or what is the data at that site or in those classrooms showing, and how am I going to respond to that data to make sure that I meet the needs, like Kathryn was saying before, of those children? We can't just assume that everybody's the same and that every classroom needs the same at that moment of time. These are live classrooms with live humans, with, these lives are not just district mandates. They're what the data is showing that those children need. And I want to take it a step further. Don't throw all your teachers in the same barrel of professional development. There's some teachers that heard about Anita Archer and explicit instruction 7,000 times already, and that's not what they need. Maybe they need more support with screeners, or maybe they need more support with diagnostics, or maybe they need more support with kids that look or present as dyslexic in their classroom and they don't know what to do. That's it. I'm finished with my spiel.
Can I give
I
Judy
want to
cheers?
pull out what she mentioned with knowledge. So, that's a hot button topic.
Faith, slow down. Nate was giving me a cheers. It was the one time my boss doesn't give me that many cheers at work. Finally, I have somebody cheering me on. No, I'm only kidding. He's a good guy. But anyway, Nate's giving me a cheers. Let him do it.
Okay, go ahead, Nate. Give her
Well,
a
to be fair,
cheers.
it's the second time I tried to give Judy cheers this podcast, but
Uh,
cheers. I really appreciate everything you said there, and I hope that nothing I said was contrary or it came across to the contrary. So
Not at
no,
all.
I don't think so. But I do want to pull out what she said with knowledge. So, I think that whole issue with knowledge is being twisted. And just like I said, I think it's
Faith, are you saying a dirty word tonight?
what's the dirty word?
Knowledge.
I thought the dirty word was fidelity, but okay.
Oh, you mean the term that everybody
The
stole?
F-bomb,
The thing
right.
that we have, the F-bomb.
Right.
Fidelity is the new F-bomb. And then
Right.
everybody else on social media posted it like 1,000 times claiming it.
Well, if we're only going with phonemic awareness, right, then it would be the N word, but it's the K word. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the K word, knowledge. Where does that fit in K-2? Based on your meta-analysis, where does knowledge fit in? We know background knowledge is important, but a knowledge building program is different from just pure background knowledge, which we know is something that all kids need, right, when they're reading. But what about knowledge building in that sense? Is this something that was brought in K-2 as, would you call it a priority? Let's talk about that. As we're talking about priorities, can you address that, both of
No walking on eggshells on the literacy view. Just let it rip.
well, Kathryn, you should go first on this one.
I had something that I wanted to say in response to what Judy said, but we'll go to building knowledge. Of course, especially again, touching on the diversity within the classroom, it's essential that we build a communal knowledge because there are so much varied experiences, and an experience that one individual feels is normal, and they don't recognize that it isn't for others, especially during early childhood. Earlier today, I was recording some podcasts with a man who has some very important historical figures in their background. And he's like, oh, yeah, in the house we have this historic artifact and that historic artifact, and, Abraham Lincoln, related to this and that. And so his background knowledge going into school was extremely different than his peers, but that was just commonplace for them. And then recognizing when we have different cultures and family histories and family makeups, what's normal for one child, especially during those early childhood years, and their lack of awareness of what's actually happening around them. And they can't necessarily say, oh, well, Sam's family is a lot different than my family. There are this many people in my family and that many people in Sam's family. And, these are their family traditions and what's authentic to their household that are completely different than my household. But then also addressing those commonalities. So creating a community of understanding of the similarities and differences while doing that knowledge building is going to help, and making sure that the words that they're coming across in texts using their scope and sequence are part of the vocabulary. I know one word that I see all the time in decodable texts that drives me nuts is pip, which is the watermelon seed, which, yes, there are kids that know what pip means, or it can be a short name, but I would hazard a guess the vast majority of today's students, unless they come from a farming background, were never exposed to the word pip before they came across it in the decodable text when they were reading their SatPin reader.
But why couldn't that background knowledge just be provided at that time? So I think there's this huge difference between providing background knowledge as needed,
Mhm.
and then you have a program that's knowledge building, and then teachers still have a social studies period assigned to them. And then you hear someone like Judy saying, this is impossible. How do you get anything done? And, it all goes back to how do you prioritize? Nate, what do you think about programs that are knowledge building programs? Where does this all fit in? What's your thought?
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm at 6 minutes before I have to leave, so I'll try my very
Oh my
best to be
God, Faith,
concise here.
Faith, you have to grill him for the next 6 minutes.
No, I'm letting him
So,
talk. Go ahead.
okay. And I think you raise a really good point. There's a difference between background knowledge instruction and knowledge building. To me, background knowledge instruction is specific to the text in front of you, whereas background or knowledge building is a systematic, explicit attempt to try and increase knowledge of the world throughout a literacy program. This is beyond the scope of this meta that we discussed today. As you and Judy both know, Kathryn and I have a meta on this topic under peer review right now. And I will say, I looked today and I found out that I've been waiting for 1 week for the editor to tell me if we passed our final round of peer review, or what I hope is the final round. But they haven't gotten back to us yet. So we could be like 2 weeks away from like publishing, or 3 months away. We don't know. But it's been a long time in the works, for reasons I can discuss at a later date. But one general thing I'll say is just putting that back into the earlier I talked about that being under the umbrella of comprehension instruction. And if we look at that in terms of the overall importance, I think comprehension instruction in grades kindergarten to grade 3 is very low in importance. And I think that if you look at the meta-analysis evidence, not even my unpublished paper, just other methods that have been done, there's not as much, anywhere near as much research as comprehension instruction in grades K to 3, in part because a lot of their texts are fiction and not abstract. Very direct, explicit texts. They're not actually hard to read or comprehend. And the barrier between students understanding those texts and not is usually decoding and fluency. And so when K to 3, I would say the biggest priority has to be decoding and fluency. Obviously, decoding comes first, and fluency is something we slowly build in. But another thing I would say in general, I released a preprint of this meta a couple of years ago as we were much earlier in the process, and the effect sizes were really high. And that was because we didn't have any outlier removal. After we added outlier removal, those effect sizes came way down. And I will say that in general, my understanding of the comprehension literature is that teaching comprehension, regardless of its knowledge instruction, strategies instruction, or vocabulary, tends to have a lower effect size than fluency or phonics. And I think even if we look at comprehension outcomes for fluency and decoding instruction, we actually sometimes even see higher outcomes in certain grades for fluency or decoding instruction than we do from comprehension specific instruction. And I think that's because oftentimes the limiting factor for younger students in their comprehension is not can they summarize or find the main idea, or do they have the background knowledge, or do they have the vocabulary? It's can they read the word on the page? And you can't comprehend what you can't read. So for me, the highest priority in grades K to 3 is just teaching kids to read. And even as a grade 8 teacher, for me, comprehension instruction is not intervention instruction, it's core instruction. So I'm constantly teaching comprehension through my core instruction as a grade 8 teacher. But when I'm doing reading intervention for our students, it's very rare I'll do an intervention, but specific to comprehension. And part of that is just because I only have so much time as a teacher. Fluency, in my mind, is actually the most important outcome. And if I have to get all of my students reading at grade level on fluency benchmarks by the end of the year, I use DIBELS personally. And I feel like a failure if all my students aren't reading at grade level on DIBELS by the end of the year. So like that's my number one benchmark as a teacher. So I think you have to prioritize fluency and decoding. And I absolutely rambled on there, so I apologize.
No, you didn't ramble. And I mean, to me, that's what you're cheering about. You're cheering about in, those early grades, getting kids to decode and to be fluent. That's the priority. So, Nate, before you go, you're going to kill me, but I'm putting you on the spot. You have to call BS on something before you
Okay.
leave this
Wait,
podcast.
why only one thing? Isn't it 3 things?
Well, at
Three
least,
things I got to call BS on?
all right,
Oh, no.
but Kathryn's going to
You're gonna
pick
get
up
three
the
groups
other
of people
ones.
mad at me, aren't you, Faith?
She's here too, but before you run off, you have to pick at least one thing to call BS on, and then I'm
Okay.
giving Kathryn a chance to think about her BS stuff. Go ahead,
Oh,
Nate.
wow. And
Let's
cheer.
go.
Wait, we cheer too.
Oh, I can call BS on anything I want.
Well, based on the work that you've been doing, okay?
Wow, don't
Okay.
call BS on Faith.
Oh, I'm not calling BS on Faith or Judy. Don't you worry.
You could, you're
It's
allowed.
pretty rare that I disagree with you guys on something. You know what? I'm gonna call the thing I think that was the most frustrating for me in this whole paper process, for just the paper we came on to discuss, was this idea of the middle. I feel like people have been advertising balanced literacy as a middle path. Balanced literacy is not a middle of the road path of instruction. I actually think in some cases the programs that are being pitched, I'm not going to name names at this moment, the programs being pitched as middle of the road or balanced or centrist are some of the most extreme examples of constructivist teaching. So I would say like a middle of the road program is probably something like UFLI. Whereas I would say something more like the traditional scripted DI programs, like Anita Archer style, that's probably more on very far end of the explicit instruction spectrum. I would say something like UFLI or Jolly Phonics even is more in the middle, although Jolly Phonics is a little more constructivist than UFLI. And the programs that people are advertising and saying these are middle of the road approaches, they're actually approaches that are on that far extreme of whole language, and they've just been rebranded as whole language, as not whole language. So for me, that's the biggest BS. And I definitely see people on social media being like, oh, I'm not anti-phonics, I'm just against teaching phonics to an extreme amount. Well, the literature is really specific. The literature says that if you're teaching phonics to a scope and sequence explicitly, that's what we have the highest support for. So the people who I see routinely be like, I'm not against phonics, I'm just against teaching it way too much, are the same people being like, scope and sequence bad. We don't need to be explicit. Well, you're very far unaligned with the science if you're saying that, in my opinion. And I think there's room to say, hey, we can overteach phonics. In fact, I sometimes say that. I think there's room to say we shouldn't go too far. We don't have to teach 100 different graphemes. We don't have to teach phonics for K to 3. It doesn't need to be 45 minutes a day, and it doesn't have to focus on deep orthography rules. I think that's perfectly reasonable to argue. I don't even know if that's true. I just think it's reasonable to argue. But I don't think it's reasonable to argue that we shouldn't use a scope and sequence and we shouldn't teach phonics to all early readers or that we shouldn't be explicit. I think that is ideologically motivated talk, and it's not necessarily accurate in any fashion. So that's my BS.
Wait, are you still here? How much longer do we have you?
No, he has
I
to
am
go.
overdue. I got a meeting with
Yes.
somebody else, but
Yes.
I've had a
Oh no,
blast coming
just
on
say
your
one
podcast.
thing. Say something
Okay.
positive. Do a cheer before you run.
Okay. Well, a cheer. Well, you know what? I'll give a cheer to everybody in this call except for myself because I don't want to pat my own back. But everybody on this call, I see on a routine basis, um, being really pushing evidence-based instruction. I think they're all very positive. I don't see you guys getting really negative with people, which I really appreciate. And I also think everybody in this call is very nuanced. And I think that's the kind of people I want to associate with in this field is people who can take a nuanced approach and be kind to the people they disagree with. So thank you
We
so much for your
appreciate
time,
your
guys. I
time.
really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kathryn, don't go anywhere because
Oh no, it's all about you now,
Bye.
Kathryn.
so, all right. So you heard the shtick from before. Something to cheer about, something to call BS on. What do you think, Kathryn? Judy's saying 3, but I'm not
Yeah,
gonna,
you know what?
I'm nicer than Judy.
No,
Okay.
debatable. Debatable.
Very debatable. Okay. Look, whatever you could come up with, something to cheer about, something you're going to call BS on. If you have more than one of each, great. Go
Okay.
to it.
Well, I think one of the most important things to call BS on is having zero knowledge about your classroom and just following a scripted program from page 1 to the end of the book without using data to inform your instruction to the students. It is so critical that you understand where your students are at and not just assume or commit a suicide, as Dr. Anita Archer would say, that they are where they should be because you don't know unless you check. And the time that you spend screening students with an effective screener isn't wasted. It's saving you a lot of time in the future. And I want to give a cheers out to teachers that are also using, I don't know whether intuition or informal measures of screening to inform their instruction is huge. In the spring, I spent time in a classroom in Manitoba, and it felt amazing. I worked with a group of grade 2 students for like 25 minutes, and we did a writing lesson because I wanted to get the biggest bang for my buck. And I asked the teacher, what are some words that consistently you see your students spelling incorrectly with their work? And you have the would, should, could that often come up that kids struggle with the L. And also the word because, which again is another one that we often see. So I took that time and explicitly taught them those 4 words. And we did a because, but, so lesson. So helping their writing instruction while explicitly teaching 4 words that they commonly struggled with. And through that repetition of the explicit teaching and the writing instruction, we were able to help them orthographically map those 4 words. So when you're able to see teachers take that opportunity and instead of going through the words in, boring, okay, let's repeat, but you're doing it so you're giving them an understanding of some of that orthographic and morphemic information, you can go a long way, and it can be done with younger students.
So, to wrap up, Kathryn,
Mhm.
when you're looking at kids and you just did the research, what would you prioritize K to 2, and what would you prioritize for grades 3 and up? If you were
K
giving
to two,
advice.
K to two, making sure that they have the foundations of the grapheme phoneme correspondences. Do they have to know that the reason why PH makes the sound dates back to Greek times? No, but it sticks in their head if you tell them that. But you want to have that explicit knowledge so that they can decode simple CVC words and two-syllable words with an understanding. And they can do that fairly easily with the repetition needed to build that orthographic mapping, which is recognizing the word within a fraction of a second without even trying. And the more they do it, the quicker they become at it. So that will build the fluency, and recognizing that some weeks are going to be faster than other weeks. Some weeks you can get those five grapheme phoneme correspondences in because they're easier ones, and then other weeks just getting one's going to be difficult. So don't say, okay, every week if I'm not ticking off 2 to 5 grapheme phoneme correspondences, I'm not doing enough. Giving yourself the understanding that it's okay to go at the speed that your class needs, especially in those early years, and taking the time to fill in the gaps for kids that have been sick or missing school. When we go to the higher grades, like the intermediate grades, 3 and up, that's where you, depending on where your class is, again, doing an initial screen, figuring out where everybody's at, and focusing the whole group lessons where the vast majority of the students are, throwing in those odd fun facts that will go over the head of kids that aren't there yet, but get the ones that have already got everything you're going to be teaching in the lesson. That's important too, because we want to make sure that we're not holding anyone back. And then once the majority of the class are working on task on the lesson topic, recognize that pulling out the few stragglers in a specific area to give a small mini lesson to, that's how you need to be using your time. It's not where, okay, here's the lesson, here's your assignment, go do the worksheet, and I'm going to sit at my desk and check my email. That's not how it works, unfortunately.
Why not? All right. I'm kidding. You know I'm kidding. All right.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up. Judy, do you have any last thoughts or questions for Kathryn?
Kathryn, what are you listening to in terms of podcasts or any great music that you're listening to lately that I should upload to Spotify?
I really like Ordinary by, is it Alex Warren? I'm bad at
I'm going to
song.
look it up later. Thank you.
And right now I'm working on a paper looking at AI and explicit instruction. So I was listening to the Chalk and Talk episode with Anita Archer.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So this was a great discussion.
It
I
sure
am
was.
so excited for your work to come out on knowledge. I'm very anxious to see that. I think we got a little taste of it today because
Mhm.
it does tie in to just what we were talking about, but you're just taking a deeper dive into that specific area. So we're going to be looking for, and I hope you will agree to return with Nate to
Of course.
discuss that. That would
Yeah,
be
we would
great.
love to break news on the literacy view.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening. And don't forget to look us up on theliteracyview.com. We have a great new newsletter. We hope you subscribe. We are busy doing a lot of different things in the field, working at conferences. So if you have a conference coming up and you want some live podcasting, don't forget to reach out to us at theliteracyview.com. We will talk to you
Yep.
soon.
And it's Faith and Judy at theliteracyview.com. Email us also. And also some updates. We have new and improved YouTube playlists. So if you really want to take a deep dive into comprehension, there's a comprehension playlist. If you want to take a deep dive into the foundational skills, there's a foundational skills playlist. If you are passionate in your school about writing instruction and you want to take it to the new level, to the next level, there's a writing playlist. And also, if you want to bring Faith and Judy to your school and your site or your retreat or your anything,
Go home.
no, Faith, let's not cross boundaries. Contact Faith and Judy at theliteracyview.com. And thank you, Kathryn, for helping us change lives one view at a time.
Okay, bye
Pleasure. Thank you so
everyone.
much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.